Hey, and welcome to another video from our Diversity and Inclusion Short Input series. My name is Nina Kiel and I'm the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Flying Sheep Studios in Cologne. Now, in case you've missed the introductory talk on why you should care about diversity and inclusion, please make sure to check it out first. You'll find the link in the description below. So last time I introduced you to hardware that can help make games more accessible to disabled or temporarily impaired players, right? But as I pointed out, the devices like adaptive controllers and switches can get very expensive very fast, and they only remove barriers for certain subgroups of disabled players. So today we're going to focus on how to make games themselves more accessible, either by implementing accessibility options, or, and that's even better, by making them more accessible by design. But before we go into detail on designing accessible games, I'd like to reiterate what disabilities actually are, because understanding this is really important for everything else we're going to talk about today. So disabilities can be defined as mismatched interactions that result in barriers. So for example, as you can see in this image, a person in a wheelchair who is encountering stairs. The person in this scenario is not disabled because of their medical condition, but because the environment was not designed with them in mind. And that also means that game developers can actually actively disable players. But we can also enable them with the design decisions that we make. And that's where accessibility comes in. So accessibility features are implemented to allow players with certain impairments to be able to play a game in the first place and to ideally have an experience that's as close as possible to the vision of the creator of that game. And in doing so, they level the playing field between different kinds of gamers. So essentially, these features exist to remove unintentional barriers, which are barriers that haven't been added to the game's design on purpose, for example, to make it more challenging, but they appear because different needs of different players have not been considered in the design process. And these needs do not necessarily refer to disabilities. As I mentioned in the previous talk, there are many possible reasons that a player might encounter these unintentional barriers. Here's an example. Subtitles are very important for players who are deaf or hard of hearing because they cannot access information that is provided through audio channels, or only to a limited extent. But subtitles are also incredibly helpful for players who are playing in a loud environment, players who have a different native language than what is being spoken in the game, or simply for parents who want to enjoy their favorite game with a sleeping baby nearby, so they have to disable or actually just lower the volume of the sound. And what I just described is called the curb cut effect. It means that by removing a barrier for one group, you might additionally remove unintentional barriers for other people as well, or simply make their experience more pleasant. And that is true for the curb cut, which was originally designed for wheelchair users, but it also benefits parents with buggies, delivery people, cyclists, skaters, and many more. So by designing your game with accessibility in mind, you not only make your game available to more disabled gamers, but you also help other people to access and enjoy your game more. Now let's have a look specifically at how games can remove these unintentional barriers. And first, let's have a look at a case study from AAA games. As you probably know, The Last of Us Part 2 really made headlines as one of the most accessible games ever developed, because it offered about 60 different options, accessibility options, for a really wide range of impairments. And it was even playable from start to finish by blind gamers because of features such as sound-based guidance system, combat audio cues, and also auto-targeting. And with the remake of the first game, Naughty Dog even added to this feature list by offering audio description for pre-rendered cutscenes. So that means that each scene is described by a narrator so blind players can fully understand where scene takes place and what exactly is going on. Now, of course, most studios do not have the resources that are required to offer such a comprehensive list of options and also make sure they work properly, because accessibility options have to be tested over and over again so that they actually do what they're supposed to do. And this issue of limited resources is especially true for indie studios. But there are actually a lot of options for those small and mid-sized companies, and even for 1 or 2 person teams. And to show you how this can work, let's look at another case study in detail. So as the case study for indies, I actually selected Hyperdot, which is an arcade game that was released in 2020. And it has a pretty simple premise. Players have to control a little dot and dodge everything that is appearing on screen. So Hyperdot was awarded with perfect scores on mobility and also deaf accessibility by the website Can I Play That? And it was generally praised as being one of the most accessible indie games to date. And that is pretty impressive in its own right, but even more so because the game was actually developed by a single person, a developer named Charles McGregor. And what's particularly interesting about this project is that McGregor actually didn't think about accessibility when he developed the concept for the game. It was much later in development when he realized that the game was really accessible due to its design, but there were still some barriers that prevented certain people from playing, which frustrated them. So he reached out to an accessibility consultant to remove as many of these remaining barriers as possible. And he ended up implementing just a few options that did not really require much time and effort, but still added to the game's accessibility in really significant ways. So let's look at these options in detail by looking at different categories. So first are features for players who are deaf or hard of hearing. Importantly, the gameplay does not rely on audio cues in any way. So deaf players or players who are hard of hearing, of course, may miss out on the soundtrack and the ambient sounds, but aside from that, they can fully enjoy the game and there are 0 barriers for them. Now, because the game strongly focuses on visual cues instead of audio cues, it's unfortunately inaccessible for blind players. But I'd like to point out that first, a single game, and especially an indie game, cannot be fully accessible to everyone, and that's okay. And second, very importantly, the developer still decided to support players with a number of visual impairments, like, for example, color blindness. So let's look at those features. As I just mentioned, there's a dedicated colorblind mode that changes the colors in the game. The color of the dot that the players control can also be modified. And there's also a high contrast mode, which helps players with low visions. And what is really great in this game is that changes are immediately displayed in the menu, as you can see here on the right side. So that makes it pretty easy for players to understand that changes have been applied and whether these changes actually accommodate them or not. So they don't have to pick an option, jump into the game, start playing, realize that the option is actually not for them or hasn't been applied properly, and going back to the menu. And I'd like to use this opportunity, by the way, to show you another example to really point out how easy it can be to implement these kind of options. So there's an indie game called Epic Eric that I discovered through my research. It's a platformer, and the developer wanted to make the game more accessible for visually impaired players by offering a high contrast mode as well. And all that was needed to offer this option was just adding a rectangle between the foreground and the background. This rectangle is transparent by default, but players can change its opacity all the way to solid black or bright white. And by changing the opacity and color of that rectangle, the foreground, as you can see on the right side here, becomes much more easily distinguishable from the background. This game was also developed just by a single person, and as the developer said, it only took them 15 minutes to implement this feature, so it was really low effort, but really helpful for many players who are visually impaired. Going back to Hyperdot, the game also has features for players with cognitive disabilities because it allows to disable screen shake and background animation, which are effects that may distract players and make the game unnecessarily difficult for some. So for example, I'm one of those players who are easily distracted by background effects. It makes it more difficult for me to actually track what's going on. So I love when games offer this kind of option. But this is just about being distracted, right? Actually, other players may have more serious challenges like nausea or maybe in the worst case, seizures, when they face too many bright flickering effects on screen. So this is a very simple but very helpful option for many different disabled players. And by the way, this is a great example of accessibility options being very similar to debug options. So chances are that you already have a way of changing or disabling specific parts of the game to make testing easier, like for example, effects. So you could, for example, turn these options into options for players by just offering to make them available for everyone, not just for yourself. That's a great way to make your game more accessible. Finally, there are features for players with motor impairments. The game offers full key customization. It supports tilt and touch controls, and it also supports the Xbox Adaptive Controller, and also eye tracking, which is amazing. So you can play this game just by looking at it and moving your eyes if you have the hardware that is necessary for that. This means that players with a range of mobility impairments can change the game controls according to what they require. And thanks to the eye tracking feature, even people who cannot move any of their limbs are able to play the game, which is great. In addition, the game offers the opportunity to disable vibration, which is very, very helpful for people who experience muscle fatigue, because holding a vibrating controller, especially for a longer period of time, can be very straining. Now, this was probably the most time-consuming feature to implement, especially because of the eye tracking support, but most of the other options that I just showed you are pretty straightforward and very doable, even if you are a single developer with limited resources. And these aren't even all the options the game has to offer. I actually decided to skip some because I wanted to keep this talk short. But you'll find plenty more options in different case studies and in accessibility guides, which are available online for free. So now I'd like to introduce you to these guides quickly. I picked two guides which, in my opinion, are particularly helpful. And that's first the Game Accessibility Guidelines, which is an online guide that is split into 3 categories for basic, intermediate, and advanced accessibility options. Now, for teams and studios with limited resources, of course, the first 2 categories are the best picks. And in each category, there's a list of considerations for different kinds of impairments like mobility, information processing, vision, or hearing. If you click on one of these links that are describing an accessibility feature, you'll be redirected to a page that explains exactly why this feature is important and how devs can implement it. And then at the bottom of the page, there are usually a couple of best practice examples from AAA to indie games. So you can easily look those up and see the accessibility feature in action. That's great. It's a really good resource. The other resource I'd like to recommend to you is the Gaming and Disability Player Experience Guide. So this is a great resource that lists potential barriers as well as software-based solutions by type of impairment. So for example, there's a category for low or no vision. And then it links to the relevant segments of the Xbox Accessibility Guidelines, which are super comprehensive. So make sure to check at least those 2 out, but there are many more of these guidelines. So you can find some of them in the resource section as well. Now, guides are great if you want to self-study and try to implement more accessibility options. But if you need more support, it might be advisable to hire an accessibility consultant. Now, in recent years, there have been more and more of those consultants, experts on accessibility, who are happy to help you if you hire them. Some of them specialize in certain kinds of disabilities, some of them are all-rounders, but there's a really good chance that you'll find the right person for your project and very likely also for your budget. So please make sure to check these people out at the very least, but these are just 3 people that I encountered time and time again who are very knowledgeable about this topic. There are plenty more. Now, if you don't have the time or the resources to hire those consultants, because of course you should pay them, there's a really cost-efficient way to at least test your accessibility features after you consulted the guidelines, you implemented those options. You need to test your features, right? And a good way to do that is publishing a demo and looking for player feedback, especially from disabled players. And Hyperdot's developer actually did exactly that. He and his publisher just sent a demo of the game to disabled streamers and then learned a lot about the barriers these players experienced by watching them play and asking what kind of options they'd like to see in the game. Today, it's easier than ever to connect with users and also build communities, and you should absolutely make use of that, not just in terms of accessibility improvements, but in general. Now, to wrap up this talk, I'd like to share a few final thoughts with you. One is that neither hardware nor software can remove all barriers. It's just not possible. But considering one or both options can really go a long way in opening up a much larger player base for your game. So there's a business case for supporting accessibility as well. And it's highly recommended to start thinking about accessibility early in the design process, ideally already during the concept phase, because it requires much less time and fewer resources than retrofitting accessibility, especially when you already have a finished product you then need to modify. Just pick any talk, any GDC talk on retrofitting accessibility, and the people who tried that will tell you that it was much harder than making the game accessible by design from the beginning. And speaking of that, you could actually consider making your game accessible by design instead of just offering options to modify it. That's a really good approach because you also ensure that your vision, the vision for the game, for the gaming experience, stays intact. Now, there are many strategies to do that. And if you want to know more about that, check out the resources that I've compiled for you. As always, thank you so much for listening and see you next time. Bye bye.